In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Please be seated. Well, the parable of the unjust steward, also known as the parable of the shrewd manager, is what we get this morning from Luke chapter 16. And this is one of the most overlooked and often, I think, least understood parables in all of the Gospels. I think for good reason. This parable is often, it's very difficult to make heads or tails of. At face value, it's a confusing encouragement of shady business dealings. This strange commendation for this unjust steward by the master who literally just fired him. What are we to make of this parable? What lessons, if there are any for us, are to be drawn from it? On its surface, the parable deals with the concept of management or mismanagement of another person's property. We've had the great honor and responsibility of this past week watching our widow friend's 4 small children for 7 days straight. She was, some of you have met her, she was widowed a few years ago, so now whenever she goes out of town for work, she has to get help with her kids. And so if you see Jessica and I this morning struggling to form words, or, with this far off look in our eyes, you know that it comes from making 147 meals over the course of 7 days for this small army of children, under the age of 10 that we had in our charge. At one point I turned to Jessica and I think I said something to the effect of, what if we just leave? Like, what's the worst that can happen? Like, it'd probably be fine, right? How bad could it, if we just lock the doors, shouldn't they be able to fend for them? Maybe it'd be a good exercise in survival for them. But then I started thinking about, the book The Lord of the Flies, where, everybody, there's all these kids stranded on an island. I think somebody dies at some point. I think there's this fascist dictator that takes over. It just could go bad. It could go bad. You very quickly see when you have this, at least a half dozen little people in your house at all times, that parenting is really, on this scale, just more like management than anything else. Like, you're just trying to keep, the food situation organized, everybody in line, make sure nobody runs away, make sure nobody dies, and you call it a success. Management, that's really all it is. It's stewardship. And in this particular case, it's stewardship of somebody else's resources, somebody else's children. Last week, if you recall, Luke 15, we read 2 parables of lost things. The parable of the lost coin, parable of the lost sheep, and in that same chapter, the parable of the lost son is kind of how Jesus wraps up his teaching. But we can assume, really, that this kind of sits right on the tail end of that. There's not any kind of a geographical transition to another area. There's no story in between the lost parables and the parable that we just read this morning. So we can assume that the same crowd is still present. You get this mix of tax collectors and sinners and disciples and Pharisees, all just kind of this diverse audience gathered together to hear what Jesus is saying. We know that much of the previous chapter was directed as a response to the Pharisees and their criticism of him. This man eats with sinners. This man eats with tax collectors. He doesn't just tolerate them from a distance. He sits down and pulls from the same loaf, from the same meats. He has to be getting dirty, somehow ritually impure. Surely, if he's doing this, surely he's impure before God. Jesus responds with those first 3 lost parables that we read last week, and then he turns to this parable. Jesus sets the stage, as is often the case, speaking to the disciples, but sort of like passive-aggressively addressing another audience, specifically the Pharisees. So let's read the parable again. Turn back to page 5 of your booklet if you would. Let's read this again. He also said to his disciples, "There was a certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. So he called him and said to him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship. You can no longer be steward.'" So what happens? The rich man, who was most likely like an estate owner, he had a number of people on his property. Think of like in the Middle Ages, you'd have like a lord and other kind of peasants renting their little stalls or houses from him. So he had a large estate. Presumably he needs help managing it. So he has this man who is his steward. Somebody lets him know that there's a problem. This man is mismanaging his resources. He's responsible for collecting rents, collecting debt payments, and in some way, shape, or form, he's squandering money. He's wasting the resources. He's mismanaging what he's been put in charge of. We don't know exactly what the issue is. But whatever the accusation that's brought before the rich man, it was serious enough for him to want to fire the guy and want to see the records. He says, "Show me the books. I got to figure out how badly you've messed this up." But this, of course, puts the steward in a tough spot. He's probably a servant or a slave of some type, and it sounds like from his comments that about not being strong enough to dig ditches or do manual labor, maybe he's a little more advanced in age. So he sort of panics. His prospects are not looking bright. It says, "Then the steward said within himself, 'What shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I have resolved what to do. When I am put out of my stewardship, they may receive me into their houses.' So it says he called every one of his master's debtors to him, said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He said, 100 measures of oil. He said, 'Then take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, 'And how much do you owe?' He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and write 80. And this is where the part of this parable gets a little bit difficult to interpret. It seems like the steward, if we take this at face value, in this desperate act, because he's about to get canned, attempts to sort of stick it to his master. One last, stick it to the man on his way out, right? He's reducing the debts owed by these renters, the people on the rich man's property. He's taking the invoices and he's reducing the outstanding amount that's owed to his boss. But then look at the next line. It says, "So the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light." So if the master, or if the steward was trying to just, stick it to his master before he gets his pink slip, then why does the master commend him when he finds out? Here's where we have to sort of piece together some more context and make a few assumptions to draw out a conclusive meaning here. In those days, as I mentioned before, a rich man would have property and have people on his land. He wouldn't always ask for money for rent. He would ask for, if you grow wheat, bring me some of your wheat. If you process oil, bring me some of your oil. And in those days, he would assign a sort of debt collector. And the debt collector wouldn't necessarily get a salary for his work. The money he would make would be the amount he could collect over what was actually owed to his boss. So if $1,000 is owed, he'd mark the debt up to $1,250, collect the full amount, and then pocket the extra $250 for himself. just sort of how it worked. And there weren't any hard and fast rules as to this, but I'm sure there was probably a sort of fair amount that was generally seen as okay to skim off the top. So perhaps this steward was making up the debts or marking up the debt so high or charging like the sky-high interest or something that caused it to come to the attention of his master. Maybe his master thought, hey, you're making me look bad. You're making me look like I'm charging 50% interest on this, seemingly insignificant debt. What we do know is that the master was incensed enough that he was going to fire the guy. So the steward knows he's going to be fired, and he knows he can't get a job in the construction business, and he knows he's too proud to go and panhandle on the streets. So he works up this scheme. I'm going to reduce the debts of the renters who owe his master money. Why does he do this? Well, he knows that it will gain him favor. Right? It says that. These people will receive me into their houses once I'm thrown out. So hopefully these people will feel indebted to him. And they'll hopefully return the kindness, when he loses his job. But if that's the only benefit, then why would his master actually commend him for doing it? Why in the world? If his master is the one getting ripped off, he could have this guy killed. He could have him thrown in prison. Why would he say, you got me, good job? Oh, why in the world would he be at least somewhat pleased with this little scheme? Well, I think what the steward was probably doing was he was probably reducing the debts of what was owed to remove his cut of the deal. And in the process, actually made his master look good. Made his master gain a reputation for being merciful and kind. A man who would reduce the debts of those who owed him money. His reputation for generosity would grow. And it would be much easier for him to gain the respect and the love of his peasants and those around him in the future. Soon the whole community would be aware of the kind-heartedness of the landowner, the rich man, and would be happy with the renters as well as thinking honorably of the generous landowner who reduced, the invoice, the outstanding amounts. At this point, I think, the steward kind of works up this scheme and sort of backs his master up into a corner. The rich man has two options at this point. First, he could gather the renters and tell them that, hey, those reductions were unauthorized. You still owe the full amount. Thereby, showing his stinginess, right? Risking that ridicule from the community. Or second, he can just keep silent. He can accept the praise that's now being showered upon him. And just allow the clever steward to sort of get away with his scheme. Again, the steward could get killed for doing this. He could easily, if he misjudged his master even in the least bit, he knows that his master is going to find out about this. If he misjudges, he's going to get thrown in prison at best, and at worst, he's going to get his head chopped off. The steward knew that the master was a generous person. Otherwise, he would not have taken such a risk. So in verse 9, we see Jesus not necessarily praising the dishonesty, but the ability of the steward to recognize and to trust in the generosity of his master. The steward saw what was coming. He saw what was ahead. He used what little time he had left to prepare a place for himself. Self-preservation. So the master commends the steward for his shrewdness. He was clever. He secured himself a better future, even though his prospects in the moment looked dim. And that steward was trusting the benevolence of his master. The fact that he was actually merciful and generous. He knew the true nature of his master and trusted that this scheme would actually result in a better future for himself. So sort of what this parable does, and we see this with a number of other parables that Jesus teaches, it serves as a sort of how much more parable. Remember, Jesus talks about the lilies of the field. He talks about the birds of the air, God taking care of the birds, providing food for them. And he says, how much more is your heavenly Father going to take care of you? If an unjust steward trusted the goodness and the generosity of his master to secure a better future, how much more should we as sinners trust the goodness and mercy of our God in seeking eternal life? The unjust steward chose to, again, if we kind of assume that he's taking off the markup, he chose to forego those final, profits that he would have made off those last handful of invoices, knowing that little bit of money would have run out really quickly. Instead, he gains a future that lasts. Favor with all these people that he knows he can go to and secure a future for himself. We trust in the goodness of our God. Our faith resides in his mercifulness. Our faith resides in him who secured our salvation, our security, everlasting life. Let us celebrate the hope of a better future that lies ahead for all the children of this promise. Amen.